hope you're doing well. Today I'm drinking a pink bourbon from Onyx Brewing Company, or Onyx Roasting Company. It's really good. It is a very light floral coffee. I would say that it's got, hints of tea, and then also probably some stone fruit, a little bit of sweetness to it, like peach. Really good. I'm sure you've noticed that I've been scaling back my videos for those of you who watch regularly. I just haven't had the time to read like I normally do. And a lot of that's because I've been spending more time writing. I'm writing the follow-up to Goat's Legacy. I'm not really sure how far into the book I am. I mean, I'm 130,000 words or so in, but I don't know if that is halfway, a third, or where in the book. So I have a pretty good idea where the next part is going to go, but beyond that, I'm not entirely sure. There is a character in the book that's somewhat inspired by Donald Trump, but I had done that whenever I first started writing the sequel, like years and years ago. I've been working on this book for quite a while, off and on. Believe it or not, I kind of feel like this is relevant to the book that I picked up this week. It was recommended by my therapist back in Portland, and my therapist was a much more religious person than I am. He went to George Fox, which is a pretty religious school here in the Oregon area. So I'm not surprised that he recommended a book that was written by someone who had recently reconverted or reconfirmed his Christianity. But I don't think that was really the reason why he suggested the book. I think he just saw it as a storyteller publishing another book that might have been interesting to me. So the book was written by Martin Shaw, and it's called Liturgies of the Wild, published in 2026. Yet another pretty new book. And Martin Shaw has a pretty interesting career. He's kind of done quite a lot of wild stuff, and so he has a checkered past but then he eventually figured out what he wanted to do in terms of like telling stories and figuring out how to like live in ways of doing stories. He lived in the wild for years and listened to what he could from the wild, and he did that with an indigenous indigenous U.S. man that went to Ireland, and he experienced the wilderness through his eyes. And I think that it's important to explain the difference between a storyteller and an author. He writes, but he doesn't consider himself an author first. He considers himself a storyteller first. And the difference really is around, he's following in the oral tradition of storytelling. So he has really dug deep into learning historical stories, learning the myths that have kind of made us, and just he has a wide variety of knowledge about stories that he can kind of rattle off from the top of his head. It's kind of like the people in a lot of books or in shows that are always quoting poems or books or scripture or something like that. He's of that ilk where he knows so many stories that he is able to recite them or pull together appropriate parts of the story to help someone understand the context that they're in. He has written a bunch of books, but they really are about, but he focuses more on how telling stories allow us to be more present in the here and now. Often that a simple story that's been told for generations can have a nearly transcendent response from the people hearing it. And he gives a number of examples of this. He talks to a young man who was going through quite a lot, and Shaw tells him this story and says, if anybody's going to get to you, they're going to have to get through me. The guy was so overwhelmed by this story, he literally jumped out of Shaw's car and they never saw each other again. I mean, I don't know what the overall impact was. Shaw thought that this was a positive impact on this guy. I don't know. Kind of crazy. And he's a big fan of going to the wilderness and fasting and using the time that you're there as you fast and meditate on the world and experience amazing sunrises and sunsets and these kind of long nights by yourself. You experience your own journey and you go through all of that. And Shaw is a storyteller who goes out with people and he helps them through these journeys. He doesn't necessarily, it's not like he gives them ayahuasca or something, but these are a group of people who are in a tent who stay awake and fast during that time period. Shaw helps make sure that they're safe. It's like a known area. He has the food and all of that. So whenever they come out of fasting, he's able to make sure that they're going to be healthy and safe and secure and all of that, which is actually fairly important for any of these sorts of things. All of it is part of getting away from modernity. He takes their phones from them. They're off the grid for that entire time. They have to make their own fires. They're all those sorts of things that take away from what we normally experience in our trappings of lives around us. And then they all tell their stories together, and they're hyper focused on just this one thing, and they're very present during this one period of time, which is not really something a lot of us are able to do. I mean, whenever I was writing the script, I was watching a YouTuber that I like that goes out into the wilderness and builds these cozy survival spaces. And he records a video. He's clearly got some sort of plan whenever he goes out. He must scout a place beforehand or and decide what he wants to do, because he has a pretty clear plan. And then after he makes these little huts, he cooks his food, and then he goes to sleep. I mean, that's the video, and he's really good at making them. And I would say a lot of these videos, the things that he makes look really comfortable, and that some of them really are hidden, so you wouldn't even know that somebody was sleeping there. Like it's like the entrance is a stump of a tree or something like that. Pretty incredible. I say this as much to relate to this book because it's kind of about being in the wilderness that way and doing something extremely away from modernity and being in nature and being with it, and that being hyper focused on one thing is a good and important thing that we should try and strive for in being present. I struggle with it, not because I always watch YouTube videos while I'm doing things, but because I almost always have music on. It helps me focus. I don't need it as much as I used to, but it would definitely allow me to focus more without my mind wandering to other things. I don't really like watching YouTube while I'm writing or, doing these sorts of essays, because I find it more of a distraction, especially if it's in a video essay or something like that. But I did it with this case, partly because it was somewhat related to the topic. And it's not like there's not research to show that being in the wilderness is good for people. In The Body Keeps the Score, he talks about how healthy going into the wilderness is, and that going and doing yoga and doing these single-minded things where you can be focused on your body and what your body's doing in the real world at the real time can help you kind of process some of these thoughts that you're having, especially some negative thoughts. And like The Body Keeps the Score by Kessel van der Kolk is a really great example of this. Really great read if you have a lot of trauma that you need to deal with and you feel it in your body, this anxiety or this if you're doing any self-mutilation or and that can be in a lot of ways, like if you're drinking or self-medicating, those can all be ways of you trying to deal with the trauma that you have underlying you that you don't even realize that you have. Lost Connections by Johann Hari is another book that kind of builds up on this. And in that book, he talks about a couple different things. Some of these are literally pulled from The Body Keeps the Score, but he also talks about alignment between your personal beliefs and the world. And I think Liturgies of the Wild is kind of addressing some of those value differences that we might need to understand kind of directly, because like Shaw is really saying that our values are totally misaligned with what we spiritually need. And Hari's book talks about that, and also talks about cases where people have been prescribed, specifically in the UK, going and doing a group gardening type exercise where they're they are so disconnected and so anxious that a treatment is provided, go and garden, and they're expected to go garden every so often, and they're with other people, and they don't have to talk to anybody. They just need to be near them, and they start to find that is pulling them out of this, and it helps them because they're rooted in physicality and in nature. Some of the things that Shaw says I'm pretty conflicted with. He's a big believer of Joseph Campbell's monomyth, which basically tries to boil down every story or myth into the same cycle. I'll try and put one here. I think it's a really reductive, and I also, having listened to people who are from different cultures than mine, it feels really a Western-centric perspective of things. And I don't think that's exactly healthy, but I also understand if you are looking at things from a Western perspective and you're trying to understand all these stories, that it's a useful lens to see things through, because it's shorthand in a lot of ways. One of the things that's part of the monomyth is always the hero goes to the underworld. And, most of the time it's not a literal thing, but there are people who are looking at the monomyth and are like, oh, well, they didn't go to the actual underworld. In Star Wars, which is certainly a hero's journey, and he kind of tells it multiple different ways, going to the underworld in the Return to Revenge of the Empire Strikes Back, that's the cave in Dagobah where Luke fights Vader and finds his own face under it. That's him going into the underworld and having this night of the soul where he realizes that there's something that he needs to understand that he's missing, or he's going to become another Vader. And he has to, I think in modern stories, there would have been like something that would be on Netflix. It would flash back whenever he was fighting Vader, and he would look in Return of the Jedi and see his hand is missing. And he would look at, he cut off Vader's hand and he looks at his own hands. There would be a flashback to that scene where he's like, poof, seeing that. In the story, we all know that that's what the subtext is, but with a lot of the way stories are being told on Netflix now, they just make it text to say, oh yeah, he's going back and remembering that thing along, and Shaw really argues that these are important initiatory events that used to happen in our lives, And they force us to really dig into who we are. And he says that while in the stories these aren't taken literally, these sorts of long nights of the souls were things that men and women were forced to experience. And if you've seen Prey, the Predator movie set in the 1900s with the native woman, she is going on an initiation rite. She is going on to this hunt where she is left alone and expected to kill this predator to show that she is worthy of being a hunter. And she approaches it from a very specific angle because of her size, her stature, her capabilities compared to men. And she comes up with a way that turns her weaknesses into strengths, and turns the weaknesses of the predator into, or of the lion into weaknesses. And of course, the hunters all scoff at her except for her brother, who we learn later in the story, he finished what she started and used the techniques and said, they worked. You were onto something. And don't forget these skills. Shaw argues that since we've lost these long nights of the soul as part of our maturation process, we've lost a significant, important ritual in our lives. I think that there are some clear demarcations in our lives that could be taken as rituals, such as high school graduation ceremonies or college graduation ceremonies. I think generally going through high school or going through college themselves don't really have that demarcation event that we might want. And because personally, I kind of felt that, there's things that kind of smudge into each other. Like in high school, I was working, a full-time job. I mean, maybe not full-time, but I was working the same job as adults, people who were uneducated. I was closing restaurants by myself. I was the only cook working, from 4 o'clock until midnight. And I was essentially given the same responsibilities as someone who was in their 20s. And then whenever I got to college, I started working a co-op job where I was moved into a position where I was an equipment engineer while I was still a sophomore in college. So I was given a full-time job doing full-time engineering work as people who were 10, 15 years my senior, and I trained someone who was 20 years my senior. So I didn't really feel like college or high school provided those transitory experiences in a lot of ways that maybe other people may have. I mean, it also didn't help that I didn't go to my college graduation, so maybe that was part of it too. But I just felt like it's like, I'm graduating, I'm looking for a job, I'm going to be starting a job in a couple months. I would have been going back to my co-op in the summer if I hadn't been going to a new job. It didn't feel really different to me. I mean, yes, there were some things that were newer because I had to go and start cooking my own food. But I mean, I'd been, preparing food on my own, reheating dinners or, whatever since I was in high school. Part of that was being a latchkey kid in some ways. So I really didn't feel like there was that hard demarcation and things just kind of bled into each other. And I do think that this is something that people have struggled with, especially in white American culture. The lack of a demarcation event that highlights these things is what I think feeds into the boys will be boys attitude for guys in their 30s. I mean, we call them guys. We don't call them men in their 30s. They feel immature. I mean, some of them were. I'm thinking of a very specific instance that happened fairly recently where a bunch of 30-year-old men were in a group chat praising Hitler, and one of them was a congressman, like a state congressman, Like that is a man, that is a professional, but because of the way that things kind of just continually blur into each other, that edgelordiness of that people should have grown out of in their teens that they didn't, there has to be some sort of reason for that. And maybe it is because we didn't have these rituals. And these critical events that are these rituals, maybe Shaw is making too much of them. Maybe it's, I'm thinking too little of some of the events that I went through that were kind of these demarcation periods. Or maybe I had a demarcation period. I just happened to be 10 whenever I got lost in the swamp with my friend Andy. And it was I got scars from it still. And maybe that was my long night of the soul. And I did that too young. And I don't know. But in other ways, if you look at Predator Badlands, which is has another same sort of this initiation ritual of going for this hunt, where I would say it's even a harsher transition for Dex, the main character of that, because his brother is murdered beforehand to allow him to go on this hunt. And he becomes a very different person throughout this process. I like Morbid Zoo. She has some really great videos about horror, and she talks about how becoming more indigenous, or using the land to fight against the predator, against colonialism in a way, is part and parcel of the first Predator movie, and it's part of Predator Badlands in a pretty significant way, of using the tools of the world around you to conquer the world, or to conquer this invading presence. And he is like Dex is dramatically changed throughout this experience in a way that Yalta culture wouldn't allow. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. It was a pretty interesting read. It was certainly the most spiritual book I have read in a very long time. I've read some philosophical books, but this was the most spiritual. It was very deeply rooted in Christianity and kind of the more spiritualness of myths and myth making than just Christianity. I had quite a few beefs with religion growing up. A lot of it was because the people I grew up around I felt were relatively hypocritical about their religion. I felt that there were inconsistencies within the religion that didn't allow me to adhere to it. The whole, if God is omnipotent, or God is omnipotent, why is there still evil in the world? Some of those gotchas, and it made me think of the Karamazov brothers, where Christ returns and he is killed by bishops because they don't want to give up power in the Orthodox Church, which ironically is also the church that Shaw rejoined, because he also was frustrated with the lack of mystery in the Christian church, the hypocrisy in people, and the Orthodox Church. If you haven't gone to a Orthodox ceremony, is very different than Catholic or evangelical or Presbyterian type churches. It is a very rapid, almost, I felt like auctioneer type speed. It was hard to keep up with what was going on. I could barely understand the guy. He was talking so quick. And it was only during the vows of my friend's wedding that I was able to understand what he was saying. And I think that was mostly for the benefit of the bride and groom. So I really did think this book was interesting. And I think if you're struggling with your own spiritualism, I think you might want to check this book out. And if you're writing, it provides some really interesting ideas around including this sort of long night of the soul. And in some ways you can think of like major crises of faith in stories is the long night of the soul that a lot of the characters are going through. And you can look at this book as a way of figuring out how to include initiation rite into adulthood, a transition period. And, do you think we're missing something from our culture because we don't have something hard like this? Maybe some people would think boot camp could be, but I mean, if you look at Pete Hegseth, I would say maybe not, but there's definitely other people. Maybe it's the transition from war back into society that some people have to go through. I don't know. I mean, I feel conflicted about this. And there's definitely some books in fantasy that I've read, like the Malzahn Book of the Fallen, where they really have these initiation rituals that are interesting. Have you read this book? Did I miss anything on it? Is there something you wish I would have covered more from the book? Let me know. And I want to thank you so much for spending your time with me. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a good one.